Now, just over a month ago, I sent out an appeal for questions and ideas for videos. So we're going to start, this will be the first of this new series of Q&A sessions or videos that have been either answered directly a request or combine several suggestions and are ones that are sparked by that sort of thing. So I'll put them in a new playlist so they're easier to find, but they'll be similar. Now, today we're going to be talking about particularly Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar, and then a little bit at the end we'll talk about Napoleon and Wellington as well. And this was inspired by this particular question: how would you rank the likes of Wellington against Napoleon, and for your other focus, Alexander compared to Julius Caesar? How much of an effect has celebrity and charisma had on their reputations? Today I'm going to focus much more on Alexander and Julius Caesar, partly because obviously the main theme of the channel is ancient history, but more because there's so much you could say about both Wellington and Napoleon that's even greater than the considerable amount you can say about Caesar and Alexander. So I will say a bit about that. If people want me to talk more about generals in other periods of history, I'm quite tempted to do some stuff on the development of both Napoleon and Wellington during their careers, how they developed as commanders, which I think is particularly easy to trace for Wellington, but is interesting from Napoleon's point of view as well, and other periods of history as well. Obviously, I tend to touch on Second World War, Napoleonic stuff, and the ancient world, but you can always ask me. I might have to admit I don't really know enough about that particular topic or that individual to do a video on it. So don't ask me to do the American Civil War, because while I can find that fascinating, I don't know enough. I simply don't know enough in that very crowded but also very interesting and intriguing field. So if you want me to talk more and do a longer video on either comparing Wellington and Napoleon, or one or the other, or looking at their armies and all this sort of thing, I've got a few ideas for some that I will throw in on these themes anyway, but it's really a question of what people want and what they fancy, and then when I can fit in the time to do it. So for today, we're going to focus primarily on Alexander the Great, the king of Macedonia in the 4th century BC, and Julius Caesar, the Roman aristocrat who became dictator, gave the name Caesar to the line of emperors that would be established by Augustus and followed on through to Kaiser and Tsar in the early 20th century. Alexander the Great is remembered as one of the most successful military commanders in history, is almost the epitome of youthful heroism. Think back to the old March British Grenadiers. It's some talk of Alexander and some of Hercules. I remember them teaching us that at school. So I've talked a little bit about Alexander in the past. I've written the biography of Philip II, his father, and Alexander the Great, and I've written the biography of Julius Caesar as well sometime before that. So these are ones where it's easier to say more from the start, but also it fits in with lots of the other themes that we talk about quite a lot. It isn't new to compare the two. So it was highly significant that when Plutarch was doing his parallel lives, as they're termed today, I'm not quite sure how he expressed it in the first place, where he looked at the career, the life of a figure from Greek history and then one from Roman history, and compared the two. He paired Julius Caesar with Alexander the Great. That seemed natural to him. But even there, at the beginning, he said, "It is the life of Alexander the king and of Caesar, who overthrew Pompey, that I'm writing in this book. And the multitude of the deeds to be treated is so great that I shall make no other preface." It goes on a little bit longer, I won't quote the whole thing, but basically to say that he can't cover everything. And also that he's a biographer, not a historian, so for him, jokes, personal episodes, emotions, that sort of thing may be more significant than the great sweep of battles and the like. So you have a willingness to compare the two that's there by Plutarch was writing early part of the 2nd century AD, so just after about 100 AD. A Greek who was a Roman, part of the Roman Empire, a Roman citizen in due course. Interestingly enough, Suetonius, writing in Rome around about the same time, a little bit later, tells this famous story, one variant of it, where Caesar himself obviously drew comparisons with Alexander, in that whilst he was Suetonius places it whilst he's quaestor in Spain. Noticing a statue of Alexander the Great in the temple of Hercules in Gades, Monte Cadiz, he heaved a sigh, and if out of patience with his own incapacity and having as yet done nothing noteworthy at a time of life when Alexander had already brought the world to his feet, he straightway asked for his discharge as quaestor of Hispania Ulterior. You'd get the office of quaestor at the age of 30, so this is Caesar looking back and feeling, well, Alexander's already outdone me in so many respects by the equivalent age. We'll come back to this a little bit, but whereas Pompey Magnus, Pompey the Great, it's in the Roman period that Alexander is dubbed the Great and that becomes established, Pompey consciously modelled himself on Alexander. He obtained one of Alexander's cloaks to wear in one of his triumphs in Rome. He acted in a way that invoked the king, as we'll see later on. Caesar doesn't seem to have done that in any active way, in that whilst there's this story, there are other variants of it, Plutarch tells one, and people aren't sure should it be dated to when he's quaestor in Spain or when he goes back to Spain as propraetor, or actually a praetorian but proconsular authority, I think, if I remember correctly. This sense of, not quite that I've wasted my life, but I haven't done anything to compare with the glory of Alexander, and it's that sort of level of eminent success, distinction, fame. That's my goal. I don't think of myself as ordinary. I should be exceptional. So Caesar doesn't too consciously draw parallels with Alexander, even though Pompey does, and that may be one of the reasons why Caesar doesn't in such a way. And later you have the story of Augustus being very careful about how people wrote about him during his lifetime, because he felt that Alexander the Great had made himself ridiculous by encouraging absurd flattery in the stuff that was being produced from his court. The accounts of his campaigns and adventures that invented so much when really you didn't need to, because what he was doing was so spectacular it didn't need embellishment. We don't have Plutarch's discussion of Caesar and Alexander, in that normally these parallel lives were concluded with a section where he'd look at the two and say, well, this is what we've learned, this is where they're similar, this is where one outdoes the other, all that sort of thing. But it's very clear in the style that he sees them both as the greatest commander produced by their societies. Caesar is the most successful Roman general, Alexander is the most successful of all within the Hellenic tradition. However, writing at around about the same time, another Greek, though in this case from Egypt, from Alexandria, Appian, who's also a Roman, again writing turn of the 1st, 2nd centuries AD, in his civil wars, when he described the assassination of Julius Caesar on the Ides of March 44 BC, as part of the conclusion, he starts to talk about Caesar, and he again draws the parallel with Alexander. So he said, so Appian drew parallels between Caesar and Alexander the Great. It seemed to him the natural comparison. And after talking about the Ides of March, he writes that Caesar was a man who was extremely lucky in everything, gifted with a divine spark, disposed to great deeds, and fittingly compared to Alexander the Great. He then proceeds to compare the two men, in most cases saying, well, they're very, very similar. They're doing the same sorts of things, just at different times. So he says that both were supremely ambitious, warlike, rapid in executing their decisions, careless of danger, unsparing of their bodies, and believers not so much in strategy as in daring and good luck. And then in more detail, we won't go through it all, we won't quote it all, because it's quite a long passage, but you've got the reference there. It's Civil Wars 2, 149 to 154. So Alexander the Great conquered in Europe first. He's referring to the campaigns against the Thracians and Illyrians just after Alexander's become king of the murder of Philip in 336. He then campaigned in Greece, he destroys Thebes, and then Asia, conquering the Achaemenid Persian Empire, going to India, leading the way. And as Appian puts it, to sum up Alexander's luck and energy in a sentence, he conquered the lands that he saw and died intent on tackling the rest. Of course, it's one of the great truths of Alexander that he dies young. And Arrian, when he talks about all the stories told about what Alexander planned to do next, Was he going against Carthage? Was he going into Europe? Was he going to Italy, conquer the Romans? All these sorts of things, that his ambitions would involve nothing mean. And the odds are you can't see an Alexander happily sailing into middle age and calmly doing nothing and actually administering his newfound and new created empire. You see him as someone who's restless and nearly always on the move. The big move was down towards the Gulf, which had at various times had a degree of Persian control, but they hadn't always to keep doing it. He was already preparing for a lot of that, and some of it was done during his, at least a reconnaissance campaign he presided over, but the main fleet, the main expeditionary force had been prepared and then is broken up because it doesn't happen when he dies. So Alexander is the great conqueror, and in terms of territory, as we'll see, there isn't really anybody in the ancient world to match him. Caesar, however, also conquered widely in Gaul and led the way. Appian emphasizes that Alexander led the way, risked his own body, went first. But he also tries to make similar claims for Caesar, claiming that he was sometimes the one man to go forward and everybody was hesitating. The main example cited of that is in the Munda campaign, 45 BC, so the very last campaign and major battle that Caesar fought, where his men are supposed to have hesitated, and he charges towards the Pompeians on his own for a while and takes, depending on which version you have, up to 200 missiles in his shield and all this sort of thing, for the armies shamed into joining him. We'll talk about that another time when we look at Roman army commanders in battle and that sort of thing in even more detail than we have so far. But anyway, Appian goes on to say that he fights 30 battles in Gaul, subdues 400 tribes, and then in the Civil War goes up to fight against modern armies. He's fighting with a Roman army against other Roman armies that have the same advantages of organization, discipline, command and control, equipment, all of these things that are not barbarians as the Gauls would be perceived. And whilst Greeks dismissed Persians as barbarians, they were very aware that the Persians were a much more organized kingdom with larger armies and a different military tradition that gave them a capacity that the tribal armies, very much disunited in Gaul, couldn't really match. So in the Civil War, he fought civilized armies under the best generals of the day, never dismayed, never lost a campaign. He goes on that both of them had magnificent armies who were devoted to them, and that the soldiers mourned them when they died and deified them. He says that both claimed divine ancestry, Alexander from Zeus Ammon, Julius Caesar from Venus, and ultimately then back to Jupiter. Both like to pardon their defeated enemies, which is very true of Caesar in the Civil War, where he parades his Clementia, to some extent in Gaul, though he could be utterly ruthless as well. But his campaigns are based around fighting a war against one tribe. So for instance, he defeats the Sequani and Ariovistus, their ally, to protect the Aedui, already established Roman allies. He then allies with the Sequani. They complain about other tribes, including the Belgic tribes, which leads to them picking on one of their allies, and that gives Caesar the pretext to go and operate ever further from Transalpine Gaul and expand his campaigns. Certainly Caesar is not someone who was ruthless or unusually cruel by Roman standards. By Roman standards, by the standards of the ancient world, he was fairly generous. Alexander, well, you have the spectacular cases where he pardons people, but you also have the sack of Thebes and the massacre there. You have some pretty grim actions when the Macedonians storm cities, whether it's Tyre, whether it's Gaza, later on, particularly in the campaigns in what would become Afghanistan and modern-day Pakistan, those areas. He's pretty ruthless, and there isn't a lot of sparing people. But then you do have King Porus, who is defeated at the Hydaspes, and when brought before Alexander, the great story is Alexander asks him, "How would you like to be treated?" Porus says, "Like a king," and Alexander reinstates him in power and in fact possibly adds to his territory. But he's a subordinate ally of the Macedonian king, but nevertheless he is left as a ruler. So you have these stories, and you have other things of Alexander respecting the women folk, the wife, the mother of Darius, the Persian king, when they're captured after the Battle of Issus. So you have these moments of mercy, of of clemency, but with both men you also have a lot of massacre as well. And if anything, you'd say Alexander, that's even more true, but that's perhaps because the scale of his campaigns are so big. But also there is a sense Alexander's war making seems to get more savage with time, and it may reflect his soldiers being rather fed up with things and just wanting to get home. It's also that it's more difficult, that every time they win a victory, there's Alexander keeps leading them forward, and there's another mud-walled city to storm, there's another mountaintop stronghold to capture, all of this thing. You've got to fight, and it's just wearing you down, and the boldest are falling by the wayside because they're the ones leading the way and running more risks and getting killed. Appian then goes on to say, so it's interesting he has that both had unequal resources, because Alexander is king, has all of Macedonia, this greatly enhanced kingdom created, or at least built up to an unprecedented level by his father Philip II. He inherits that, he becomes king, he has an army, he has money, he has all of this behind him on which to embark whilst in his early 20s on these great adventures, whereas Caesar is from a noble family, part of the Roman aristocracy, but not heir to the throne or anything like that, and is also rather short of money. He has to borrow a lot during his campaigns. So Appian does highlight one of the big differences to which we will return again and again during our more deep comparison we're going to do in a moment, because it does matter. Caesar and Alexander are not the same in the sort of careers they have. Even though Caesar ends up as dictator, sole ruler of Rome, he doesn't start out that way. That's very near the end of his career, and he is murdered because he has done that. Alexander is king, and whilst Macedonian kings often get overthrown, often get assassinated, just as Philip his father had been, nevertheless, and there are the plots obviously against Alexander and the turning on Parmenio and Black Clitus and others, that Callisthenes, the people who suffer because the king ceases to trust them, the pages, that sort of thing. Nevertheless, the position of King of Macedon is very different to being a Roman aristocrat, having a public career where you are elected to office and then voted powers by the Senate or by popular vote in the case of Caesar's command in Gaul. Appian also says that both of them tended to ignore omens, did not punish those who gave bad ones. And in this case, he's focusing particularly on what's been the last sort of section of his book, dealing with the Ides of March, beware the Ides of March, all this sort of thing, the warnings Caesar had that he chose to ignore, and then he comes back to some of the ones about Alexander near the end. Again, there are mixed traditions about this, that sometimes Alexander could get angry. You have the case of his wreath blows off whilst he's on the expedition down the Tigris, and a sailor dives in, rescues it, but so that he can swim back, puts it on his head, and he's rewarded and then executed for the impudence of wearing the royal diadem. And again, it's not so clear. Suetonius will also say similar things about Julius, that he's never held back by bad omens. He always thinks he can turn them round to his own good. And you have, again, similar stories of Alexander battling the waves, or grabbing the soil, as Caesar is told that, yes, I've got my grip on this country, all this sort of thing. He also, Appian highlights their thirst for knowledge, their quest for wisdom. Both were eager to learn, and he emphasizes they were willing to learn from outsiders. So Alexander in India sought wisdom from the philosophers, as they're called by some of the Greek sources, but the various guru type figures there, the people who are considered to be wise in that culture. Caesar did the same in Alexandria, where primarily he's drawing on the Greek tradition, but a Greek tradition modified by the earlier Egyptian tradition, and that tendency exemplified by the library at Alexandria to try and bring in knowledge from elsewhere and translate it into Greek and put it into Greek format. So Appian compares and contrasts the two, and he doesn't try to say that either was a better, more able commander than the other, nor does he pass a judgment on whether it was for the good of the wider world that either of them had their careers. Did Alexander do a good thing by conquering all this territory, by creating this great empire? What did Caesar do to Rome, to the Republic, by fighting the civil war, becoming dictator? And again, another similarity, notice that both of them were planning more expeditions when they died. Caesar was obviously about to move east first to the Danube and then out to deal with the Parthians and lead an expedition there, which of course, had that happened, would have invoked even more parallels with Alexander, because of course no Roman could even vaguely look in the direction of the Eastern Mediterranean, let alone the Euphrates and beyond, without poets and others starting to say, oh, we're going to do all that Alexander did and more, and so on. There's great glory waiting to be won. So the two of them were often linked in the past, and there are similarities, and they do seem to have stood out to many ancient observers as the pick of the bunch, in a sense, the most distinguished, the most famous, the most successful commanders of the Greek tradition and the Roman tradition. So let's have a look at them by a few topics, and from this we'll talk about each in turn, and we'll try to do this compare and contrast, and then eventually at the end we'll go back and we'll look at the same topics for Napoleon and for Wellington. So let's start with their careers. Obviously can't tell these stories in too much detail, having written about both of them. If you want my take on it, it's out there in the Philip and Alexander and the Caesar Life of Colossus. So I've written a lot on this. If you want more detail, that's the place to go. We'll deal with Alexander's career. First, he is child of Philip II and one of his wives, Olympias. Philip marries 7 or 8 women, depending on how you count and how many were wives. This doesn't seem to have been in succession. There is a little bit of evidence to suggest that it was acceptable for the royal family of Macedonia to be polygamous, for the king to have more than one wife. This wasn't normal, as far as we can see, in Macedonian society, even probably amongst the aristocracy. You would normally have one wife at a time, but for the royal family, there's enough cases that this seems to have been at least within the range of what was considered normal. Alexander is the only son, when Philip dies, to be considered a viable heir. You have a half-brother who is mentally and physically crippled, considered incapable. Subsequently, after the murder of after the death of Alexander the Great, whether murder or more likely natural causes, he becomes a figurehead ruler for a while, but he doesn't last. He doesn't have the ability. Philip had recently married when he'd murdered. You've had the estrangement with Alexander, you know, the argument where the new father-in-law effectively has questioned Alexander's legitimacy, and they've had a drunken row about it, and Philip's tried to get to him and fallen over because he's plastered. All of that. However, even though Philip's wife is pregnant, his latest wife, when he's murdered, she and the child will be killed allegedly by Olympias, perhaps with Alexander's involvement, perhaps not. But even if that child had been born, it would have been a long time, and had proved to be a boy, would have been a long time before it really would have been a viable candidate for the throne. So there isn't a lot of competition. Alexander acts very quickly. He is only in probably 2021 when Philip's murdered. A few years before, at Chaeronea, he has fought under Philip's command in the battle against the Theban and Athenian-led alliance of southern Greek states, played a distinguished role, broken the ranks of the sacred band, all that sort of thing. Whether he did that on horseback or on foot's another matter. We just tend to, there's been this tendency to assume that Alexander and Philip always use exactly the same tactics in every battle, which to me doesn't make a lot of sense, but that's another deal. So he's had some military experience, he's done a few things before, and Philip has already embarked upon this war of revenge against the Persians, revenge for the Persian invasion 150 years or so ago, and the sack of Athens and all this sort of thing. Alexander will take this on. So he fights to confirm Macedon's dominance of its neighbours, both to the north, the Thracians, Illyrians and like, and also to the south, particularly Thebes is the main centre, and Thebes is sacked during that. He then crosses to Asia Minor with an army numbering 40,000-50,000. We had not long ago a video on the Battle of Granicus, the first major battle he fights. That's his first victory. He leads the charge across a river, fights hand to hand, strikes down men with his own lance, his own Zeiston, is nearly killed or crippled by a Persian nobleman coming up behind him. His life is saved by Black Clitus cutting off the man's arm. Alexander wins. From there, he goes on to this rapid campaign, and because he has Philip's army that's been created, he can fight through the winter. He fights nearly all the year round in a way that armies did not, as a rule, at this time. They're also very good at sieges. They take stronghold after stronghold. You will have the Battle of Issus the following year, where he finally, for the first time, meets Darius, the Persian king, and a much, much larger army than the one raised by the local satraps that he defeated at Granicus. Granicus is a relatively small battle compared to what comes. He beats the Persians, he captures the city of Tyre, captures the city of Gaza, he goes down to Egypt, he goes out to the shrine of Zeus Ammon, where it will later be claimed, including by Alexander himself, that the priests signify the god accepts him as his son. Egypt pretty much defects to him. They didn't like the Persians very much, and Alexander treats them with a bit more respect. He then moves back. You have the Battle of Gaugamela. Darius is defeated a second time. Alexander pursues him, gets to Persepolis, the royal capital, loots it, burns it. Darius is hunted down, is murdered by his own men. Another one of his commanders proclaims himself king. He's hunted down and he is executed not just as a challenger to Alexander, but as a regicide who'd murdered Darius. From there, Alexander continues to move eastwards into areas that had been on the borders of the Persian Empire, but hadn't always been kept secure, depending on just how strong the Achaemenid king of the time was. And that had varied. Obviously, Darius himself had only got there after the murder of the previous king. So Alexander keeps on going, campaigns there for several years, Bactria, Sogdiana, places like this, crosses the Hindu Kush, eventually gets into northern India, what will become present-day Pakistan, comes up against Porus, defeats him at the Hydaspes, pushes forward, and his men refuse to go further. There's the mutiny in the army where a lot of these soldiers who've fought for so long want a break. They don't want to just keep going and attacking again and again. Alexander is forced to give in with not great grace, but he does it. There are some executions. He then retires, but on his way back, he follows a different route with the main part of the army that stays with him. Some of it goes back the way they've come, and he continues to attack and conquer others. Eventually makes his way back to the heartland of the Persian Empire, back to Babylonia, to Babylon, and there starts to plan these expeditions down towards the Gulf, towards the sea, and there's talk of all sorts of other monuments. Personally, he begins as the young son, the unproven ruler, commanding Philip's men. Not only his senior officers, but most of his soldiers are Philip's men who've campaigned with great success under Philip II, don't yet necessarily know what to make of this youngster. So some of the conspicuous heroic leadership that Alexander shows, particularly at the start, maybe to prove to everyone, look, you're going to win under me and I will always go first. I will take no risk that or expect you to take no risk that I'm not willing to take myself. Like Philip, he gets wounded repeatedly, more seriously later on when he's shot through the chest with an arrow during the withdrawal from India. One of these, as I say, the withdrawal where they're still basically attacking, you're just going in a different direction back towards the heartland. He becomes more suspicious. He eliminates Parmenio, one of the senior marshals, really, of his father. He kills Black Clitus in a drunken rage. He executes Aristotle's nephew, one of the historians accompanying him on campaign. He executes these pages, well, that's probably the wrong word, but again, we can talk about that another time. He becomes, in many respects, more angry, nastier, and you have the theories that, perhaps he's drinking too heavily, perhaps the injuries catching up with him. He does not, however, seem to be someone on the brink of death. in his last years, and he's certainly planning big things, and his death does come as a surprise when he falls ill and dies. Whether or not this is natural causes or some conspiracy, who knows. He has not married until partway through the Persian expedition. That means there's no heir, even though, again, a baby is expected, rather like Philip. He's left a wife pregnant, and it does prove to be a boy. This child is not able to establish itself in Roxanne's son as viable king, because he's not going to be strong enough, active enough. He's not going to be an adult with a reputation to deal with the pretty fractious Macedonian aristocracy. So Alexander dies whilst having great plans. His empire that he's created, that stretches from Europe, Macedonia, that area, down to Egypt, the deserts to the west, throughout the Persian Empire, into the areas by the Caspian Sea, down into northern India. Vast, vast area required in less than a decade, really, of intensive conquest. That falls apart. It fragments. Some of it is lost on the fringes. More of it is carved up by his generals. Most of the men who appear have had fairly distinguished roles under Alexander, and they fight each other in the funeral games that follow his death. And you have that story of almost his dying words being, "To whom do you leave your empire? It's to the strongest." This idea, and that's what happens whether he wanted it or not. So although a lot of the area that he's conquered remains ruled by Hellenic rulers with a strong Greek influence, Alexander's empire does not survive him in any meaningful way. It fragments. Caesar's career is rather different, because again, this comes back to the point that Caesar is an aristocrat, a magistrate of the Roman Republic, and not a king. His career is fairly normal. He is born into a time when Rome is starting to break down into civil wars. So, when he's about 12, Sulla marches on Rome for the first time. Within a year later, Marius and his allies will do the same. The level of violence escalates. Sulla will return later in the 80s. You have the proscription list. For a while, Caesar is a hunted fugitive because he refuses to divorce his wife, who is the daughter of one of Sulla's main opponents. And he's supposed to bribe his way to freedom when he's arrested at one point, catches malaria, all this sort of thing. But eventually, influenced by his mother and by her relatives that include Julii Caesares of a different branch of the family, registered in a different voting tribe, who have been much more favourable to Sulla all the way through and are approved of by him, persuade Sulla to let him back. The sources preserve this story that Sulla warns, people, well, all right, you can have him if you want, but there's more than one Marius in this man. That you get these prophecies that Caesar is aiming towards supreme power, dictatorship, overthrowing the state right from the beginning. They don't make a lot of sense. They really don't work, but this is hindsight. Caesar was clearly ambitious, but for the first few decades of his life, his ambition is conventional. He serves as a military tribune in the late 70s. That's his first elected post. He appears in the courts. Again, he's not born to lead armies and given this right to do it in the way that Alexander has. He serves as an elected officer within an army of the Roman people commanded by probably Crassus. The best guess is that he serves with Crassus in the war against Spartacus. He will subsequently be elected quaestor in his year when he gets to 30, serves in Spain, one of the two Spanish provinces, and does well during that. He will be elected aedile. He will celebrate not only spectacular public festivals, which is part of the aedile's job. By the way, if you hear a strange rumbling sound, I don't know when the microphone's picking it up or not, but that's Gussie the cat snoring. He's in the basket behind me, and it slightly sort of amplifies and increases the volume of what's already quite a contented, purry snore anyway. But that's that. It's not my stomach rumbling or anything like that. So Caesar has, I'm sorry, I can hear it very, very prominently, slightly distracting, but anyway, let's see. Caesar becomes aedile. He also celebrates funeral games for his father, who died much, much earlier, with gladiatorial fights, which are the only context where you can do those now. And he does show a keen interest in gladiators, and ends up owning thousands of them. He will appear in the courts again. He's a prominent figure. He plays a role in major debates. He gets elected to the praetorship. He is involved in the debate over the fate of the Catilinarian conspirators and takes a dangerous line in that there have been rumours that he's been involved with them. And not only does he turn up in the Senate in defiance of all of that, but then argues that you shouldn't do anything rash, you shouldn't execute the prisoners without trial, denying them their rights as Roman citizens, but you should hold them hostage or hold them prisoner until you've defeated Catiline and his army, and then decide how to deal with them legally. You know, for somebody who's had question mark over his loyalties, that's a very bold statement to make, but it's also, Caesar has been flamboyant. You know, he's not king, he's not spectacular, he's just one aristocrat amongst many, and he doesn't have as much money as others, and his family, his particular branch of it, has not done well politically for a long, long time. But he wears long sleeves to his tunic. He girds his tunic loosely so it hangs down lower. He lets his hair grow a bit longer, a bit more shaggily than others. He sets a trend for the sort of dashing rakes of the aristocracy. They will copy Caesar, but Caesar is the man who establishes a lot of these styles that are then associated with the followers of Catiline and afterwards. He's elected praetor. That's part of the reason why he has a prominent role in this debate, because he's a magistrate elect. He also gets himself elected Pontifex Maximus, in spite of coming up against a sort of establishment candidate in the form of Catulus. This is the time where he's supposed to have spent a lot of money either on his campaign, or if you take some of his critics' views, in bribing the voters. It's probably within the bounds of what was normal for Roman voting at this time. You know, he's supposed to leave his house and say to his mother, well, I'll either come back as winner or I'm not coming home at all, because he's got these huge debts. He's borrowed lots of money. People are willing to invest in him because they think he's got a great future ahead of him, and therefore will be able to pay them back in favours and other useful connections. He goes off to govern further Spain, fights a campaign there, drastically increases the size of his army. It's relatively small scale compared to what will come. It's fairly, sort of standard provincial frontier warfare for one of these provinces that faces still hostile communities, or communities that will be hostile because the Romans often provoke them. But you see, these are not described in any detail in our sources, but you get glimpses of what's going to come. But up until this point, he hasn't had a huge amount of military experience. You've had the episode of the pirates, you've had the episode where, as a student studying the East, one of Mithridates' raiding parties comes into Asia and Caesar goes there, raises a local militia and defeats this group. So there've been these things. He's been tribune, but he is not a military man until really he's into his late 30s. And then as praetor, he goes to Spain for a few years, comes back, stands for the consulship, gives up the triumph which he was likely to get, so that he can go into the city and stand for election unimpeded, and becomes consul, has the informal alliance with Pompey and Crassus, tries to get Cicero involved, but he's not having any of it. Comes consul in 59, gets Pompey and Crassus what they want, lots of disturbances, lots of rioting, each side raising the stakes and trying to provoke the other. He then gets voted by the Papal Command, initially of Illyria and Cisalpine Gaul. Transalpine Gaul gets added because the governor happens to die. This leads on from 58 BC to his Gallic campaigns, where for the next 8 years or so, pretty much every year, he fights an aggressive war. He interprets his remit very, very broadly, but within you can still argue, as he does in the commentaries that he writes to recount this, and they're probably released year by year, that what he's doing is entirely proper for a representative, a governor of the Roman people, and that it's in Rome's interest. I'm going off, I'm doing this because it's the right thing to do for us and our allies, and I'm doing it really spectacularly. And all these victories are won by nostri, our men, our lads, our boys. He wins all these battles, he bridges the Rhine twice, leads a punitive expedition against the Germanic tribes beyond. He goes to Britain twice. He does all these really spectacular things. More days of public thanksgiving are voted to him than to any previous Roman commander, including Pompey. Things like that may well get Pompey's backup. The personal alliance, Pompey has married Caesar's daughter. That's broken when she dies as a result of childbirth, and the child dies as well. Pompey drifts closer towards people who dislike Caesar. This leads to all the tension that in January 49 BC will lead to Caesar crossing the Rubicon in the Civil War. Simplest explanation for it is the one given by the poet Lucan, that Pompey would not accept an equal, Caesar would not accept a superior. Pompey is willing to side with people like Cato and others, Metellus Scipio, whose daughter Pompey has married after becoming a widower when Caesar's daughter Julia dies. Pompey sides with them and wants Caesar to sort of trust him that I'll protect you, and Caesar's not willing to do that. The Civil War then follows. We can't go through in great detail, but Caesar overruns Italy without Pompey really doing much to it. Pompey evacuates Macedonia. Caesar then overruns Spain, where Pompey has, as Caesar put it, an army without a commander. He then goes to fight Pompey in Macedonia, a general without an army. It's not really true. Things don't go entirely as planned at Dyrrhachium, but he turns things around when Pompey challenges the battle near Pharsalus, and Caesar hammers him. And Pompey flees, does what a Roman shouldn't do. Caesar goes off, pursues him, ends up in Egypt, gets caught up in the affairs of Cleopatra and her brother and co-ruler Ptolemy the 13th, and obviously Caesar has the affair with Cleopatra. Civil war breaks out again. Whilst he's there, he has the Zela campaign, Vini Vidi Vici, came out, saw I conquered, where he fights against the army of Pontus. Then goes to North Africa, the Thapsus campaign, defeats Metellus Scipio and others. Finally, in 45 BC, he defeats the last Pompeians in Spain, and the Munda campaign. He becomes, during the course of this extended dictator for life. And the whole idea, Sulla has made himself dictator but then resigned it. Caesar says that, well, he was a political illiterate to do that, doesn't know his letters. Though when he said that and in what context, we don't know. Caesar is murdered when he's planning to go off and fight a war against probably the Dacians on the Danube, and then the big one, the Parthians in the east, avenging Crassus, avenging this humiliation to Roman arms in the Carrhae campaign and the subsequent Parthian invasion of Roman Syria. He appoints magistrates for the next 3 years before he leaves, or before he is about to leave, which suggests that he's probably thinking of a 3-year campaign or so would come back. He is, however, murdered in the meeting of the Senate on the Ides of March 44 at the age of 56. So Alexander dies in his 30s. Caesar's dramatic career doesn't really get going until his 30s, and particularly his later 30s and 40s, and then he lasts his 50s, where he definitely dies violently. So the careers are both spectacular, but they are very different. So let's look at starting out. How do they begin? And this comes back to Appian's point. Alexander is a king. Now, it was very fortunate for him that Philip died when he did, that Philip was murdered when he was, because he has created this incredibly effective military force, this very strong Macedonian kingdom. He has brought most of the states of southern Greece to accept him as hegemon, as ruler, as leader for this campaign of vengeance against the Persians. I mean, of course, the big irony is that during the real Persian invasions, Macedonia had been part of the Persian Empire and on the Persian side, but now they're emphasizing just how very Greek they are. It's an excuse. It's very difficult to say that a century and a half onwards, you really do have a legitimate grievance to go to war again. But nevertheless, that's what Philip does. And by ancient standards, perhaps this is, things tend to be very lucid. Pretty much, if you've got the capacity to do it, then it's justified to do it. So he inherits a big army. He inherits a war. Had Philip lived on longer, had he not been murdered, he'd been a bit more careful, then Philip would have led that war with that army. He would probably have been fairly successful. It's hard to see him having the same levels of energy as Alexander, but he might well have achieved a lot. He might well have taken the western part of the Persian Empire, perhaps. Who knows? Whether or not he would have taken Alexander with him is not at all clear from our sources. Would Alexander have stayed behind as regent? If Philip had lived on for another 10, 15, 20 years, would there have been another heir, a challenger? Certainly Alexander would then have inherited not as the dashing young hero, but instead as a more mature older man, and that can be both good and bad, but it would certainly mean that he would not have brought the same restless impatience and energy to him. This whole thing, the idea of his pothos, his yearning, his longing for glory, that is so prominent in the sources. Obviously, the fortunate circumstances from Alexander's point of view, his father's murder was one of the reasons why people at the time and later said, well, was he involved? You know, did he arrange these things, or did Olympias, his mother, arrange these things? So Alexander has a starting point that is very different from Caesar. He is king. His army consists first and foremost of the other Macedonians, the Hetairoi, his companions, it's almost a sort of feudal sense or a tribal sense of relationship. The king leads the Macedonians because that's his job. They have to live up to him. He has to live up to them. It's a very personal relationship. Now, the rest of the army is tacked on, but the core of it is always the Macedonians, until perhaps the very end, when Alexander is starting to recruit more and more Asian troops, and you get the ones that have been trained as a phalanx and all this sort of thing, and the dissatisfaction, disquiet, anger from some circles of his army. It is interesting that Justin, admittedly writing a lot later, claims that the troops Alexander chose to take with him were mainly mature men. These are the veterans of Philip's campaign, not a load of 19, 20-year-old new recruits trained up and still eager, which means that many of these people were getting on quite a lot, decade or so onwards, and having marched thousands of miles and fought battle after battle and siege after siege. Not many big battles, but lots of fighting in and around cities and outside them, lots of ambushes, lots of surprise attacks, this sort of thing. Lots of hard marching, lots of hard campaigning. So Alexander has this incredible army placed at his disposal. He has to prove himself to them. We do tend to take it for granted that he's going to become Alexander the Great. Everybody knows he's a genius. Everybody knows he's this great battle winner from the start. They didn't at the time. He has to prove himself to them, and it probably takes a while before this becomes his army rather than his father's army. But nevertheless, it's a very different thing to Caesar's case. Caesar, as we've said before, is a Roman aristocrat. But the difference is that Caesar has lots of competitors. There's only one Alexander. There's no brother that's really in any sort of state to challenge him. And there's no other, Philip, one of the things he has done is savagely prune the different branches of the Macedonian royal family in his rise to power. And they've been doing it to themselves in the infighting before that and various murders. But Philip's makes sure there aren't many of these blokes left around. There's nobody really to challenge him. Caesar's not like that. Caesar knows he grows up with people against whom he will compete at every stage of his public career. And he has to compete. He can't just be proclaimed by the army, made king, and that's it. He knows that unless somebody murders him or unless he dies, he is going to remain king. He can plan things. Caesar doesn't have that luxury. He has to be elected, which means winning over the favour of the population, which is partly why he borrows so much money to spend so spectacularly on the games and entertainments, on just advertising himself, why he's active in the courts, why he looks different, why he stands out, or even his womanizing is probably a way of being talked about, being gossiped about, not always in a favourable way, but at least people know who he is. And you can at times feel sorry for people like Bibulus, who is his colleague both as aedile but also as consul in 59, that he is always overshadowed by this flamboyant, charismatic showman that Julius Caesar is. Cato arranges for Bibulus to be voted 20 days of public thanksgiving in late 50 BC for what seems to be, by Cicero's account, a fairly disastrous but also minor expedition in northern Syria in the Mount Amanus area, matching Caesar and more than anything Pompey had ever had. So there's that connection with Cato, but it's the nature of Roman politics that you compete with the same people again and again at every stage. And you go, right, Gracie is scratching the door, wanting to go out. Okay, cat. Yep, won't favour us with a meow. So you'll have to take my word for it that I've just let Augustus himself out. But we're not talking about Augustus in this video anyway. So Caesar is elected, and although later on, from January 49, he will seize power by force, he fights a civil war, wins that civil war, gets made dictator, nevertheless, even then this is not unchallenged. And of course he will be murdered by people who don't think there should be a dictator, anybody should be supreme permanently in Rome. So it's a very different society. Caesar is doing a very different thing. He simply does not have the starting point, the opportunity of Alexander. So let's look at their enemies. With Alexander's case, then obviously he is fighting against the superpower of his day. Achaemenid Persia is more than 2 centuries old, has been incredibly successful. It was at its height. Geographically, it's coming close to matching the Roman Empire at its height, even later. It doesn't quite do it, but it's still pretty big. And the population is not quite as big as the Roman, but nevertheless, this is huge. And it is highly successful. And obviously the early ones like Cyrus, the first Darius, have been great military men and successful. As time has gone on, the great king isn't necessarily such an able man, hasn't had to fight his way to power. You've had lots of infighting within the royal family that's led to murders and the power of eunuchs and wives and other things, palace conspiracies and palace intrigues. Nevertheless, Alexander has this formidable army, but the Persians have more manpower, more money to move against him. Now, as it will turn out, tactically, they don't manage to work out how to defeat the Macedonians in battle, but they do try. The Granicus is probably more of an encounter battle, not planned, as I've argued in the video on that. At Issus, Darius chooses the ground, he's maneuvered so he gets behind Alexander's army, and sets up a defensive position that he thinks will negate the Macedonians' advantages. It doesn't work, but it's a logical thing to try. At Gaugamela, he also tries to rely more on cavalry on the scythe chariots, and again, choosing the position in which to fight. And all of these battles are hard-fought encounters. These are not, later on, people will be dismissive. Alexander, later on, particularly the Greek tradition, that, the Persians were easy meat, they were just effeminate barbarians and all this sort of thing. But that, that wasn't the case at the time. With hindsight, you're going to win, but they didn't. And all it would have taken at any stage for Alexander to be killed or crippled, or even suffer a serious defeat, would probably discredit him. But if he dies, that's it. There's no heir. There's no viable candidate to unite the Macedonians and keep this war going. So the Persians are formidable. Later on, Alexander will encounter all sorts of different peoples, various types of Scythians and others, the different mountain tribes in Central Asia. He'll move into India. He'll come up against war elephants. The battle at Hydaspes is quite a confused one. Again, more of an encounter battle, but it's hard fought. So he does face formidable opponents, and he faces states that are able to organize and field more troops than Caesar's foreign opponents, and even than his Roman opponents to a great extent. Alexander does fight great numbers. They're probably exaggerated. The idea the Persians have 1 million men and all this sort of thing makes no sense, but nevertheless, these were large armies, though sometimes you have a problem in that within that army you have exceptionally good fighters and lots of people who are more there to look impressive and be spectacular and who get in the way. There is also that problem that Darius hasn't really fought big battles against this sort of enemy before, doesn't really know how to handle these actions. So he makes mistakes, but again, we know he's fighting Alexander the Great and the Macedonians, and that probably the best thing to do would be to not fight them if you possibly could, and avoid battle as long as possible and try and wear them down. Which is within the initial campaign is the strategy recommended by the Greek mercenary fighting with the satraps. But they don't do that. Nevertheless, these are formidable opponents, but they don't have, where you could look back and say, well, in the Persian wars, Greek heavy infantry, not even the pikemen of those days, but the hoplites had again and again proved themselves superior to the Persians, both foot and mounted, that the 10,000 with Xenophon and his famous account of the Anabasis have beaten everything that was in front of them at the Battle of Cunaxa, and although their leader's been killed, they then fight their way out. So that superiority is just magnified by Alexander and the Macedonian army he brings. Nevertheless, the Persians are formidable opponents. Famous one would be Major General Fuller, the armoured corps theorist and the fellow involved in the First World War, formation of the tank units, and then wrote all this stuff. He liked Alexander. He didn't think much of the Romans and Julius Caesar. For him, the Gauls that Caesar fights and the Germans are just basically a load of sort of tribal barbarians who can't be organized, aren't well equipped, and they're relatively easy meat compared to the organized armies of the Persians. Nevertheless, you think back to the Cimbrian Teutones, where a succession of Roman armies has been hammered and wiped out. Arausio, the casualties were compared to Cannae. Tens of thousands of Roman and Italian troops are probably massacred in 105 when the two consuls are defeated in battle by the Cimbrian Teutones. Yes, Marius has beaten them later, but there's still a sense that the Romans mainly win against armies like the Gauls and the Germans, but they don't always win. Caesar's battles in several cases seem to be hard fought. Obviously, he's pitching it, he's telling us the story, so he wants to present these as formidable opponents. It is striking that he is able to adapt his army to fight in different ways, and even whilst in Britain chariots seem to perplex him at first and they don't quite know how to deal with them, they do work out how to do this. So the opponents are different. One key difference is that they are nowhere near united. There is nothing like Achaemenid Persia in Gaul. So even though Caesar will talk about huge numbers facing him, not just for the Helvetii or Ariovistus, or the Belgic Confederation, but the big alliance that's formed in 52 BC for the big rebellion then that comes to relieve the army in Gergovia and Lycia. So it's a different type of opponent. It is not politically united, which on the one hand means they won't all come together and you can beat them in one battle and they say, all right, fair enough, we give up, or a couple of battles it takes with the Persians. On the other hand, that means you've got to fight lots of battles and operate in different ways. Caesar's army ends up getting close in size to the one that Alexander starts off his campaigns with when he invades in 334. It never reaches the numbers that Alexander commands in the later periods when he's added on lots of allied units from Central Asia. However, as Appian pointed out, Caesar then fought the civil war. So on the one hand, you could say, well, all his campaigns are in Britain, in Gaul, across the Rhine. They're sort of colonial operations, asymmetric warfare, a sophisticated, organized, disciplined force with good logistics against tribal opponents who are disunited, not trained, undisciplined, unprepared, this sort of thing. In the Civil War, he comes up against Roman armies, so they have the same kit, the same tactics, the same doctrine. He comes up against Pompey, considered to be the greatest general of his generation. He comes up against others that are less capable. His army is seen as more experienced and more effective at the start of the war. But again, that becomes diluted as he recruits more and more of new troops, but also defeated enemies, change sides. However, he is never clearly defeated in battle, and he doesn't lose a campaign. So he is able to take on other Romans and defeat them. So he does face dangerous opponents, but it's a different sort of thing to Alexander. So let's think about... Oh, okay, I was going to put one about... we'll leave that. If you look at their achievements, the ability of each one and the ability of others involved, we have to think about the armies they've got. Alexander inherits this very confident, very cohesive team that he's taken on from his father that's already been campaigning for a long time and winning. And it continues to do so. He convinces them that they'll win under him as well. That's good at sieges, that gives it a great advantage. Caesar has a standard Roman army. The first 4 legions that he takes over in Gaul are already there, raised by other people. He then adds to it. During the course of his campaigns, he will raise new legions. He will promote officers within those legions. And there's this emphasis on taking officers from an experienced unit, giving them a higher grade as centurions in newly raised units to pass on their experience, but it also rewards people. But Caesar's army is not a recent creation. It is a standard Roman army. He makes it extremely loyal to him. He makes it very confident, very efficient. He turns it into this very well-practiced team. But that's during the course of campaign. So he's doing similar sort of things that Philip has done. He is not as far as we can see, a great innovator, as Philip had been. Essentially, the army he commands is just a Roman army of the day brought to perfection, as he would see it, or as close to that as possible. As commanders, Alexander has lots of Philip's men, so very experienced marshals, and they tend to dominate in the early years. As time passes, more and more of his own contemporaries and his own chosen men will be promoted and go further on. Caesar again has the same thing. He's choosing from the aristocracy. He doesn't have this hardcore of practiced men. He gets Labienus, who does very well, who gets trusted with far more major independent commands in Gaul than anybody else, but who joins the other side, fights with the Pompeians, perhaps going to an earlier allegiance, perhaps not, perhaps he was just pretty miffed with Caesar. We don't know. I'll look into that another day. Other than that, there is a tendency that he has Mark Antony, but Mark Antony is not very military experienced at this point, and mostly Caesar needs him for political jobs, so Antony doesn't do a lot of fighting in the Civil War, relatively little in the Gallic campaigns because he's back in Rome campaigning for office. Curio joins Caesar, doesn't do too well, gets killed. People like Caelius Rufus. He doesn't have a lot of experienced men, at least from the big families. Now, militarily, that doesn't seem to be too much of a problem. At least wherever Caesar is, the army does well. Independent commands with others don't do necessarily so well. But on the other hand, his opponents, the Pompeians, have the problem they've got too many cooks, essentially, or too many chiefs, not enough Indians, as the old saying goes. There are lots of very bolshy senators who want to be in charge and are challenging his authority and all this sort of thing. So there are difficulties involved. But you have, again, the advantages with Alexander that allows him to do all this far quicker. So Alexander's achievements are spectacular. Caesar doesn't, whilst he conquers territory and adds that to the Roman Empire, which by ancient standards is seen to be a good thing, Alexander conquers far more faster. His campaigns are spectacular and nobody else really does this. You're getting to, you could start to talk about the Mongols and things with Genghis Khan and all this sort of thing in terms of territory covered, but it's against a very different type of opposition. Nobody in the ancient world does an Alexander and can match this. However spectacular their conquests are, you simply can't. And there's all sorts of things that come into that. It's partly the ability of Alexander, but it's that combination of an exceptionally gifted, ambitious, restless leader, this incredibly good, confident army that's just better than anything around, that isn't just good at battles, it's good at campaigning, it's good at sieges, and can just keep going. And a Persia that's perhaps less strong than it has been, and from then on there's just this momentum. The more you keep winning these, victory feeds victory. Caesar's operating on a different scale and in a different environment, and again, throughout his Gallic campaigns and his accounts of them, he's presenting himself as not this ruler who's just going on for his glory, his pothos, who conquers an empire as Alexander does, and then starts saying, well, actually, I'll have some more. Oh, the war's not over, I've got to kill any challenger. All right, the war's not over, I've killed all the challengers, but some of this territory used to be Persian, we better take it back, we better assert ourselves. And, oh, well, let's keep going because that will show our strength and all this sort of thing. While Caesar does push the boundaries of what he can do, he's always presenting this as this is good for the Republic. There is not the personal ambition, because he's not a king, and he's also not an Alexander. He's older as well. He's a different sort of personality. So a lot of others contribute to their achievements. Neither man could do what they did without the armies, without their subordinates, without the opportunities given to them. Caesar is operating in a very different environment. That means he just can't come off and do an Alexander. And whilst he wins great victories in the Civil War, obviously those are ones that are not as simply glorious as when you're fighting foreign enemies of the state, because you're fighting and killing other Romans. Now, Caesar tries to be merciful, his clemency, all this sort of thing, and is trying to look ahead and say, well, I'll win the battle, but I want to win the peace and create a viable regime. Again, that comes into questions of just what his ambitions were in the really long term, which again, far too much to deal with today. So other people contributed a lot to them. Caesar does things. Caesar does exceptionally well within the context of a Roman magistrate and pushes that beyond anything that even Pompey and others had done before. Alexander does more than any Macedonian king has ever done, than any other king will match, but he's operating on a different scale from the start, and he's got different priorities, far fewer restrictions on what he can do than Caesar faces. Impact on the world in terms of, are they good or evil? Never simple, these sorts of things. It's all very well saying, well, this is what happened and this is terrible. Both men kill a lot of other human beings, or give orders that kill a lot of other human beings. The talk that Pliny later on says, that Caesar kills 1 million people in Gaul, enslaves 1 million more, and wins all these battles. And this isn't really something to be too proud of, that you've got the record for killing the most people, but it's not a very nice record. One suspects the casualties in Alexander's campaigns were on the same scale, perhaps even higher, given the number of settlements that are stormed. Probably not necessarily the same sort of number of formal slaves. Alexander conquers this great empire. It spreads Hellenic culture that was already present in some of these areas within Asia, but it makes it far more important. So it adds to the cultural mix that helps for the exchange of ideas more widely. Greek being the dominant language, but nevertheless it draws upon, it allows Greek scholars access to other ideas from elsewhere. Things are transferred. The sense of how big the world is has greatly increased. India was very, very mysterious to Herodotus. They have more idea of what was there, though even then very tall tales are told about Alexander's exploits there. So Alexander's a great conqueror. He fought an aggressive war with, certainly by modern standards, very dubious justification for this, vengeance for this Persian invasion a century and a half before. He takes the Persian Empire. He creates this new empire of his own. Again, what he planned in the future, all this stuff, the British historian Tarn, earlier in the 20th century, this idea of Alexander as almost this sort of pre-Christian saint, someone who wants to create this brotherhood of mankind and merge the cultures and races together and create this one great peaceful kingdom. That's all wishful thinking. Alexander didn't do that. He doesn't even seem to be making significant efforts to try to do that. You have to look at the evidence in a very skewed way to see that. Some scholars see him as little more than a thug who goes out to be just a spectacularly successful thug. He is a conqueror. The Persians themselves had conquered that empire. The Cyrus, from the start, that's how it had happened. So you're one conqueror taking out an older group of successful conquerors, as is often the way with human history. By ancient standards, this is admirable, at least mostly, though people have some criticism. He didn't really prepare for the future. He doesn't seem to spend too much time consolidating, establishing new forms of government within this empire that he's created. He seems far happier, or at least more comfortable, staying on campaign and keeping on campaigning, keeping on fighting. Had Alexander lived on, had he turned into a lame, one-eyed drunk like his father, would he have been remembered? There's that element where the youthful hero dies while they're still young and good-looking. Greatly affects their influence. So it's in the question at the start, how much this publicity machine, how much the idea of Alexander takes off, to the point where you have the Alexander romance that will have such a long life through the Middle Ages of Alexander doing all these incredible things, Alexander the hero. Caesar, of course, has a similar afterlife in that he is murdered, his great nephew, the principal heir in his will, and a man who posthumously, after Caesar's dead, will eventually proclaim, well, actually Caesar adopted me as his son. The man who'll become Augustus creates the Principate, creates the rule of the Caesars. That name is taken on and becomes the name synonymous with power right the way through the Roman period and beyond, so that, Charlemagne, again, that's an interesting one. Charles the Great sees himself succession to the Caesars, and in a sense succession to Alexander as well. Azar, a Kaiser, as I've mentioned before. Caesar kills a lot of people in Gaul. He conquers lots of people. By Roman standards, as he was at great pains to claim in his commentaries and accounts of his campaigns, this is justified. This is a good thing for Rome. He interestingly has that view where he understands why the Gauls are fighting against him and praises them for fighting for their liberties and sees this as natural, but also sees this as natural and the right thing for him to do as a Roman, to subdue them because it's in Rome's interest to do this. And it makes Rome's power and wealth and security greater. Coming in with 21st century's ideas of right and wrong and imposing them on these figures from the ancient world or anybody else doesn't really tell you anything more than about your own ideas. These things happened. If Alexander had died at the Granicus, if Black Clitus hadn't been as fast, if Caesar had died of malaria or been executed under Sulla, how would history have happened? Very differently, but we simply don't know. We can only talk about what happened. So good or ill isn't simple. Both men changed the world significantly. Alexander more obviously because of creating this new Hellenic influence over a wider area, establishing this dream of glory that lasted throughout history. Caesar changed Rome by crossing the Rubicon, winning that civil war, becoming dictator and allowing the career of Augustus that couldn't have happened without Caesar, that creates the Principate, the rule of the emperors, that leads to the Pax Romana, the prosperity of the Roman Empire, that huge influence of, it's interesting that the cultural aspect of the legacy of the ancient world is this Greco-Roman culture, which is very much shaped by the culture of Hellenistic history, Alexander onwards, and Roman history coming together. So that has had a profound influence on the Western world and from the Western world more widely throughout the globe. So they made a big difference, but again, simple good or evil, I don't think you can say that. There is a lot to admire in both. There is quite a bit to deplore in both. They were pretty ruthless individuals, but they could also be kind. They are conquerors. Their actions led to the deaths of a large number of human beings. But again, that's true of an awful lot of leaders in much of human history. So it's hard to dispute that Alexander earned his title the Great, and it's hard to dispute that Caesar wasn't profoundly important and a great man. But as I tried to say in the conclusion to my biography of Caesar, great doesn't mean good, doesn't mean nice, doesn't mean these were particularly easy people to be around. So great doesn't need to mean good, but it does mean important. Both of them shaped the history of their own states, but more widely. Caesar changed the map of what would become the Roman Empire. Would they necessarily have pushed on to Gaul, let alone Britain, without him? Maybe, maybe not. Again, we don't know. If these men hadn't lived, you cannot say what would have happened because there are so many possibilities, and you don't have the luxury of playing them out to see what happened. So they're important men. Ultimately, whilst you can say they are both very gifted commanders, it's fairly pointless arguing, well, if Caesar and his army had come up against Alexander and his army, who would have won and all this sort of thing. We don't know. So many factors would have come into that. I think it's the last of the Magnificent Seven films when Lee Van Cleef is playing the Chris character, and the journalist is asking him about this fight against Comanches, and so many of us surrounded by all this sort of thing. And I said, well, what happened? He said, we had a hell of a fight. It would have been a very tough campaign. It's like asking, would Alexander have conquered Italy if he'd lived on and gone that way? Would he have conquered Carthage? You wouldn't stake too much money against him because obviously his record is that he tends to win. But again, who knows? Things you can have overstretch, you can get tired. These are different opponents. Something the Duke of Wellington said later was how hard it was with one army to fight more than one opponent, because you get used to the strengths and weaknesses of one particular adversary. Going off doing other things is that much harder. It was one of the reasons he's admired Napoleon's record, that he'd done that. He'd gone and beaten everybody for such a long time. We'll come on to those two in a moment. But in essence, you are not comparing like with like. Caesar is the servant, the magistrate of a republic. Alexander is a king. And the age in which they live. Caesar lives in a world where there isn't a big empire out there, other than the Parthians that when in the early stages of Caesar's career are not at their strongest point. And he was about to have a go at them. Again, what would have happened? Would it have been a great success? Would it have been a disaster? Who knows? The speed of his conquest is to an extent eased by the fact that he is taking over at first this centralized empire. So that makes it easier. He can overrun things and people will defect him as they do in Egypt and elsewhere. Caesar doesn't ever do that. He has to do it piecemeal. So it's a little bit like William the Conqueror in 1066. He can take over Anglo-Saxon England with its existing administration far more easily. He doesn't have to conquer it region by region, even though there obviously is subsequent fighting after Hastings and rebellions and all that sort of thing. So they are just different. Their careers are different, their armies are different. The Romans didn't fight a Hellenistic-style army at its height. I mean, the closest to Pyrrhus's campaigns, there's a question about that. We'll talk about that in another video. Caesar comes up against a sort of army of Hellenistic style to some extent when he's in the Zela campaign, but this is not anything like the army that Philip and Alexander themselves had led, or even the early successors. Things have changed a lot by then. So essentially you can't really compare the two because they are not the same and they are operating in different worlds. What they have in common is that both are spectacularly successful within the context of their lives, the worlds where they have their careers. So that's the conclusion, in that hopefully it's interesting just thinking about them and considering some of these points. When we come to Napoleon and Wellington, the theme is very much the same. You are not comparing like to like. Were it